The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital emergency room hummed overhead like angry wasps, casting a harsh white glow across the crowded waiting area. I shifted uncomfortably in the plastic chair, feeling the sharp pain in my left side intensify. With each shallow breath, the clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m., and I'd been sitting here for nearly 3 hours, watching as patient after patient was called ahead of me. My name is Frank Rodriguez. At 62 years old, I thought I'd seen it all. 24 years in, the Marines had taught me patience, discipline, and how to endure pain without complaint. But tonight something was different. The stabbing sensation that had started as a dull ache that morning had grown into something that made me break out in cold sweats. I glanced around the waiting room, taking in the familiar scene of modern American healthcare. A young mother bounced a crying baby on her knee, her eyes red with exhaustion. An elderly woman in a wheelchair dozed fitfully, her oxygen tank humming beside her. A teenager with a skateboard leaning against his chair held an ice pack to his swollen ankle, texting rapidly on his phone with his free hand. The triage nurse, a stern-looking woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, occasionally emerged from behind the reception desk to call out names. Johnson, Michael Johnson, she'd announce, when another person would disappear through the double doors leading to the treatment area. But never my name, never Frank Rodriguez. I'd given them my information when I first arrived, explaining the pain, the difficulty breathing, the way my chest felt tight like someone was squeezing it in a vice. The intake nurse had barely looked up from her computer screen as she typed, asking routine questions about allergies and insurance coverage. When I mentioned I was a veteran, she'd made a note on the form. But it seemed to carry no weight in this sterile environment. The pain shot through me again, more intense this time, and I couldn't suppress a quiet grunt. An older gentleman sitting next to me looked over with concern. "You okay there, friend?" he asked, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who'd spent his life in the rural South. "Been better," I managed, forcing a weak smile. "Just waiting my turn like everyone." Elsie nodded knowingly. "Same here. Been waiting since 9:30. They told me it might be a while since it's not life-threatening." He gestured to his bandaged hand. "Cut myself pretty good working on my truck, but I guess it's not bleeding enough to be urgent." This was the reality of emergency room triage. In America, a system designed to treat the most critical cases first, regardless of arrival time. I understood the logic, respected it even, but that didn't make the waiting any easier when each breath felt like it might be my last. I thought about my late wife, Maria, and how she used to fuss over me whenever I got so much as a head cold. "You Marines think you're invincible," she'd say, shaking her head as she made me soup and forced me to rest. "But you're not made of steel, Frank. You're human like the rest of us." If she were here now, she would have marched up to that desk and demanded answers, her fierce Puerto Rican spirit blazing in defense of her husband. But Maria had been gone for 3 years now, and I was learning to navigate this world alone. The house felt too quiet without her laughter, too empty without her cooking, filling the kitchen with warmth and delicious aromas. I'd thrown myself into volunteer work at the VA hospital, helping other veterans navigate the system. But tonight, I was just another patient in an overwhelmed emergency room. The automatic doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss. A family rushed in, carrying a small child who was crying inconsolably. The triage nurse immediately sprang into action, and within minutes, they were whisked away to the treatment area. I watched them go, remembering my own children when they were small. How Maria and I would panic over every fever, every bump and bruise. My son David lived in California now, working as a software engineer in Silicon Valley. My daughter Carmen was in Denver, teaching elementary school and raising 2 kids of her own. They called regularly, but they had their own lives, their own responsibilities. I hadn't even told them about coming to the hospital tonight. Why? Worry them over what was probably just indigestion or a pulled muscle? The clock ticked past midnight, and the waiting room began to thin out slightly. A few patients had been called back, others had given up and gone home. But the pain in my side was getting worse, not better, and I found myself gripping the armrest of my chair so tightly, my knuckles were white. I closed my eyes and tried to use the breathing techniques they'd taught us in the course for managing stress and pain. In through the nose, hold for 4 counts, out through the mouth. But each deep breath sent another spike of agony through my torso, making me wonder if something was seriously wrong. The triage nurse appeared again, clipboard in hand, scanning. The waiting room. For a moment, our eyes met, and I felt a flicker of hope. But her gaze moved on, settling on a young woman who'd arrived after me, calling her name instead. I settled back into my chair, resigned to continue waiting. Unaware that everything was about to change, the night shift change brought new faces to the emergency room, including a tall, athletic nurse with kind eyes and graying temples who moved through the waiting area with purposeful steps. Her name tag read, Jennifer Martinez, RN. And there was something about her bearing that spoke of experience and compassion. She'd been making rounds, checking on patients, offering reassurance to worried families, and ensuring everyone was as comfortable as possible given the circumstances. I had dozed fitfully in my chair, the pain making it impossible to find any real rest. The waiting room had grown quieter as the night wore on, with only the most persistent cases remaining. The harsh fluorescent lighting had been dimmed slightly, giving the space a more subdued atmosphere, though the underlying tension of people in distress remained palpable. When I felt someone approach, I opened my eyes to find Nurse Martinez standing nearby, reviewing a patient chart. Something made her pause and look in my direction. Her professional gaze took in my obvious discomfort, the way I was holding my side, the pallor of my skin, the careful, shallow breaths I was taking to minimize the pain. "How long have you been waiting, sir?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine concern rather than the routine politeness I'd grown accustomed to from the hospital staff. "About 4 hours now," I replied, trying to keep any trace of complaint out of my voice. "I know you folks are busy. I can wait." "Ouch," she frowned, clearly troubled by this information. "For hours? What symptoms brought you in tonight?" I explained about the pain, how it had started mild that morning, but had progressively worsened throughout the day. As I spoke, I unconsciously shifted in my chair, trying to find a position that didn't feel like someone was stabbing me with a hot knife. The movement caused my sleeve to ride up slightly, revealing the edge of the tattoo on my upper arm. Nurse Martinez's eyes caught the glimpse of ink, and she stepped closer, her professional interest clearly piqued. What she saw made her pause completely, the distinctive eagle, globe, and anchor emblem of the United States Marine Corps, rendered in the bold, slightly faded style of military tattoos from decades past. The design was classic, traditional, speaking of service from an earlier era when such tattoos were both a mark of pride and a permanent commitment to brotherhood. "Excuse me," she said quietly, "but may I ask about your tattoo?" I looked down at my arm, where the sleeve had revealed the familiar symbol that had been part of me for over 40 years. "Got it after boot camp at Paris Island, 1982, I said with a slight smile. Seemed like the thing to do at 18. My drill instructor would have killed us if he'd known we snuck off base to get them. Her expression changed immediately, look of recognition and respect crossing her features. "What unit did you serve with?" "2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. Did 3 tours, once in Lebanon, twice in the Gulf. 24 years total before I retired as a gunnery sergeant." The words came easily, as they always did when talking to someone who understood military service. Nurse Martinez straightened slightly, and I caught something in her posture that spoke of familiarity with military bearing. "My brother served with the 8th Marines," she said softly. "He was killed in Iraq in 2004. Lance Corporal Miguel Martinez." The waiting room seemed to fade away as those words hit me. I knew that look in her eyes, the mixture of pride and grief that military families carry when they've lost someone in service. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, words carrying the weight of someone who'd stood at too many military funerals, folded too many flags. She nodded, composing herself with the professionalism that medical personnel develop to function in the face of constant human suffering. But something had changed in how she looked at me. I was no longer just another patient in an overcrowded waiting room. I was a brother in arms, a connection to the service member she'd lost, a reminder of the sacrifice and dedication that defined the Marine Corps. "Semper Fi," she said quietly, using the Marine motto that meant always faithful. I responded automatically, feeling the familiar surge of pride and belonging that came with that simple exchange. Without another word, she turned and walked briskly toward the reception desk. I watched as she approached the triage nurse, speaking in low, urgent tones. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see the change in body language. The way the triage nurse looked up sharply and then turned to look at me with new attention. Within minutes, the atmosphere around me had shifted completely. The triage nurse approached with a wheelchair, her earlier indifference replaced by focused concern. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, "we're going to get you back to a treatment room right away. I'm sorry for the delay." As they helped me into the wheelchair, I caught Nurse Martinez's eye. She gave me a small nod, the kind of acknowledgement that passed between Marines, subtle, respectful, but carrying volumes of meaning. In that moment, I realized that my tattoo hadn't just been seen. It had been understood by someone who knew what it represented, who had personal reasons to honor the service it symbolized. The pain in my side was still there, still sharp and concerning, but suddenly I wasn't facing it alone in a room full of strangers. I was part of a brotherhood that extended beyond the military into the civilian world, where those who understood service recognized and honored it. Even in the sterile environment of a hospital emergency room, the transformation was immediate and profound. As the wheelchair moved through the double doors leading to the treatment area, I could feel the shift in how I was being perceived and treated. What had been a night of frustrating anonymity suddenly became an exercise in professional medical attention and genuine human care. Nurse Martinez walked alongside the wheelchair, speaking quietly with the triage nurse who was now moving with obvious urgency. "Room 7 is open," she said, "and Dr. Patterson is available. Given the symptoms and the timeline, we need to rule out several serious conditions immediately." They transferred me to a hospital bed in a clean, well-equipped treatment room. The contrast with the crowded waiting area was stark here. I was surrounded by medical equipment, monitors, and the focused attention of healthcare professionals who were suddenly treating my case as a priority. The pain was still there, still sharp, but somehow it felt more manageable now that I was finally receiving care. Dr. Patterson entered the room within minutes. A middle-aged physician with the kind of calm competence that comes from years of emergency medicine experience. She introduced herself while simultaneously reviewing my chart, her trained eye taking in my vital signs in obvious distress. "Mr. Rodriguez, I understand you've been experiencing severe abdominal pain for several hours," she said, already moving to examine me. "Can you describe exactly where the pain is located and how it's changed since it started?" As I explained my symptoms, I noticed Nurse Martinez quietly briefing Dr. Patterson on my military service. The doctor's expression grew more serious as she listened, not because my veteran status changed my medical needs, but because it provided important context about my pain tolerance and tendency to minimize symptoms. "Many veterans, especially Marines, are trained to push through pain," Dr. Patterson explained as she began her examination. "They often present to the ER much later than civilian patients because they're accustomed to enduring discomfort. Means when a Marine says he's in severe pain, we take it very seriously." The examination was thorough and professional. Dr. Patterson palpated my abdomen, listened to my breathing, checked my heart rate and blood pressure. Each touch sent waves of pain through my torso, but I gritted my teeth and cooperated fully, drawing on decades of military discipline to remain still and provide accurate information. "I'm concerned about several possibilities," Dr. Patterson said after completing her initial assessment. "Given your age, your symptoms, and the location of the pain, we need to rule out conditions like appendicitis, gallbladder inflammation, or potentially something more serious. We're going to start with blood work and imaging studies immediately." Within minutes, a medical technician arrived to draw blood, while another wheeled in a portable EKG machine. The efficiency was remarkable. What had been hours of waiting was now replaced by rapid, coordinated medical care. I found myself thinking about the military medical corps, the Navy corpsmen who had provided emergency care during my deployments, and how their dedication had saved countless lives. Nurse Martinez remained nearby throughout the process, not just monitoring my medical care, but providing the kind of personal attention that made all the difference. She adjusted my pillows, brought me a warm blanket, and checked periodically to ensure my pain levels were manageable. "You know," she said during a quiet moment while we waited for test results, "my brother used to tell me stories about the Marines he served with. He said they were like family, that once you were a Marine, you were always a Marine, and Marines took care of each other no matter what." I nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. The Marine Corps had taught me about brotherhood, about the idea that no one gets left behind, that we take care of our own, regardless of circumstances. Tonight, in this emergency room, I was experiencing that principle in action, extended by someone who understood its importance through personal loss. "Miguel would have been about your age now if he'd made it home," she continued, her voice soft but steady. "He wanted to be a teacher, maybe coach high school football. Instead, he's buried in Arlington National Cemetery, but his sacrifice meant something. It meant that people like you could come home and live full lives." The words hit me hard, reminding me of the responsibility that came with survival, with making it through deployments when others didn't. I thought about the Marines I'd lost over the years. Good men and women who'd never had the chance to grow old, to sit in emergency rooms with their own aches and pains. Dr. Patterson returned with a serious expression, carrying results from my blood work and initial tests. "Mr. Rodriguez, I have good news, and news that requires immediate attention. The good news is that we've ruled out heart attack and several other life-threatening conditions. However, your blood work shows signs of inflammation, and your white blood cell count is elevated. Combined with your symptoms and the location of your pain, I believe you're experiencing acute appendicitis." The diagnosis hit me like a physical blow. Appendicitis at 62 wasn't uncommon, but it was serious, potentially life-threatening, if not treated promptly. All those hours I'd spent in the waiting room, the condition had been progressing. It's potentially worsening to the point where complications could have been catastrophic. "We need to get you to surgery as soon as possible," Dr. Patterson continued. "I'm calling our surgical team now. The good news is that we caught it before rupture, thanks to getting you back here when we did." As the medical team began preparing for emergency surgery, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the medical care I was receiving, but for the human connection that had made it possible. A tattoo, a moment of recognition, and a nurse's understanding of service and sacrifice had literally saved my life. The surgery was successful, lasting just over an hour. When I woke up in the recovery room, the sharp, stabbing pain that had dominated my night was gone, replaced by the duller ache of surgical incisions and the fuzzy sensation of anesthesia. Wearing off, Dr. Patterson was there to greet me as I regained consciousness, her face showing the satisfaction of a job well done. "The appendectomy went perfectly," she explained, reviewing my chart. "We used a minimally invasive laparoscopic approach, which means smaller incisions and faster recovery time. You'll be here for a day or two for observation, but then you should be able to go home and recover normally." As the medical details sank in, I found myself reflecting on how close I'd come to a much more serious situation. "Doc," I said, my voice still rough from the anesthesia, "how much longer could I have waited before things got really dangerous?" Her expression grew serious. "Honestly, Mr. Rodriguez, you were probably within hours of your appendix rupturing. If that had happened, we would have been looking at a much more complex surgery, extended hospital stay, and significant risk of complications. The fact that we got you into surgery when we did likely saved you from weeks of recovery and potential life-threatening complications." The implications of her words weren't lost on me. Those hours I'd spent in the waiting room, dismissed and overlooked, had brought me to the brink of a medical emergency. If not for Nurse Martinez's recognition of my Marine Corps tattoo and her decision to advocate for me, I might have continued waiting until my condition became critical later that afternoon. After I'd been moved to a regular hospital room, Nurse Martinez stopped by to check on me. She was no longer officially assigned to my care, but she'd made it a point to see how I was doing. The gesture meant more to me than I could easily express. "How are you feeling, Gunny?" she asked, using the nickname that Marines used for gunnery. "Sergeants." It had been years since anyone had called me that, and hearing it brought back a flood of memories and emotions. "Much better, thanks to you," I replied honestly. "I've been thinking about what happened last night, and I need you to know that your actions probably saved my life. If you hadn't noticed my tattoo, hadn't understood what it meant," up a hand, stopping me mid-sentence. "You don't need to thank me for doing what's right. My brother died serving his country. Every veteran who comes through these doors carries a piece of that sacrifice with them. It's the least I can do to honor his memory and your service." We talked for a while about her brother Miguel, about my own service, about the bonds that connect military families, even when they've never met. She told me about growing up in a military household, about the pride and worry that came with having a family member in uniform, about the devastating day when the casualty notification officers came to their door. Miguel used to write letters home talking about the older Marines, the NCOs who looked out for the younger guys, she said. He said they were like fathers to the whole unit, making sure everyone came home safe. I like to think that's what you were like, the kind of Marine who took care of his people. Her words touched something deep inside me, a recognition of the role I'd tried to play throughout my military career. Taking care of Marines had been more than a job. It had been a calling, a responsibility that I'd carried with pride and dedication. As visiting hours approached, my son David called from California. I'd finally contacted him that morning to let him know about the surgery, and he was planning to fly out to help with my recovery. The conversation was emotional. He was grateful. I was okay, but also frustrated that I hadn't called him sooner. "Dad, you can't keep trying to handle everything alone," he said, his voice carrying the concern of a son who'd watched his father struggle with independence since his mother's death. "We're family. We're supposed to take care of each other. We should." Words echoed what Nurse Martinez had said about Marines taking care of their own. And I realized that the bonds of family and brotherhood extended far beyond military service. Whether in uniform or not, we all needed people who would advocate for us, would recognize when we were in trouble, and step in to help. Over the next 2 days, as I recovered in the hospital, I was struck by the number of staff members who stopped by to check on me. Word had spread about the veteran who'd nearly been overlooked in the ER, and many of the nurses and doctors made it a point to visit, to thank me for my service, and to ensure I was receiving the best possible care. On the day of my discharge, Dr. Patterson provided detailed instructions for my recovery and follow-up care. She prepared to leave. She paused at the door and turned back to me. "Mr. Rodriguez, I want you to know that your case has prompted some important discussions among our staff about how we identify and prioritize veteran patients. We're implementing new protocols to ensure that military service members receive appropriate recognition and care regardless of how they present to our emergency department. The news that my experience might help other veterans receive better care was perhaps the most meaningful outcome of the entire ordeal. The idea that future military service members might not have to endure what I'd gone through gave purpose to the pain and frustration I'd experienced as I was wheeled out of the hospital to where David was waiting to drive me home. I spotted Nurse Martinez at the nurses' station. She looked up and caught my eye, giving me that same subtle nod of recognition and respect that had started this entire chain of events. "Semper Fi, Gunny," she said quietly. "Semper Fi," I replied, understanding that some bonds transcend the boundaries of time, place, and circumstance. The tattoo on my arm had faded over the years, but its meaning had only grown stronger. In a sterile hospital emergency room, it had served as a bridge between past and present, between service and sacrifice, between a brother lost and a veteran saved. Most importantly, it had reminded me that no matter how alone we might feel, we are all part of something larger than ourselves, communities of service, sacrifice, and mutual care that extend far beyond the boundaries of military service. As we drove home through the quiet streets of our small Texas town, I found myself thinking about Maria and how she would have reacted to this entire experience. She would have been proud of Nurse Martinez, grateful for the care I'd received, and probably planning to send thank you cards to the entire hospital staff. But most of all, she would have reminded me that accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a recognition of our shared humanity and the bonds that connect us all. The Marine Corps tattoo on my arm would continue to fade with time, but the lesson it had taught me that night would remain vivid forever. Sometimes the most important. Battles are fought not with weapons, but with recognition, compassion, and the willingness to stand up for those who have stood up for others.